Inspired by a true story from the 1950s, set against the backdrop of war and rigid prejudices in a Southeast Asian country, a time when even a single glance could be enough to tear hearts apart forever. The names of the characters and some details have been fictionalized, but the emotions, the loss, and the journey of finding each other again are entirely real. That year, the war had not yet ended, but life in the streets was slowly returning to its usual rhythm. Military trucks still rumbled across bridges, ships carrying soldiers still docked and departed, leaving behind clouds of red dust and silent, lingering gazes. By the river, there was a small tea shop, a thatched roof of dried palm leaves, wooden tables worn from time, and a young woman named Lien, who helped her mother run the stall every day. She was not strikingly beautiful, only gentle-eyed and petite, often lowering her gaze as she moved. One breezy afternoon, a dark-skinned soldier from Africa, his name was Malik, appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, with deep, soulful eyes. He was part of an expeditionary unit temporarily stationed near the town. They did not speak the same language, but some things needed no translation. On the first day, Malik stood at a distance. On the second, he stepped closer and bought a glass of iced tea. On the third, he smiled and gave a quiet nod. And so it continued. Every evening he returned. Sometimes for a sweet pastry, sometimes just to sit in silence by the wooden table near the water's edge. Lien continued to pour tea, clear tables, and lower her gaze. But inside, something had begun to stir. Not because of words, but because of what had never been given to her before. A kind gaze, quiet respect, and a silence that felt warm instead of empty. The townspeople began to whisper. Some pitied her. Others scoffed. A poor local girl and a dark-skinned soldier? It was unheard of, but Lien paid no mind. She only knew that when Malik was near, the sky seemed softer, and the noise of the world faded. No one knew when love found them. There were no roses, no love letters, only quiet evenings where two souls sat side by side over a cup of cooling tea, listening to the wind ripple across the water. Malik never made promises. He only looked at her for a long time, then placed a hand over his heart, as if to say, "I carry you here." And though Lien could not understand all his words, she understood his eyes, the eyes of a lonely soldier, discovering love for the first time in the midst of war. Beneath an old wooden bridge, where clusters of purple crepe myrtle bloomed and fell each morning, a love quietly took root. No grand gestures, no fanfare, yet deep enough to be etched into a lifetime. July 1954. Malik received orders to withdraw. The war in Indochina was ending, and the expeditionary forces were being sent home. That afternoon, as rain drizzled over the town, Malik arrived at Lien's tea shop with a heavy gaze. He didn't need to speak. She already knew. It was time to say goodbye. Lien hesitated, her hands trembling as she handed him his final glass of tea. Malik held her hand for a long time, then placed in it a small cloth bundle, inside a stack of money. Everything he had saved during his time stationed there. With the few words of her language he had learned, he spoke softly. "You keep baby." Then he gently touched her stomach. She nodded, tears slipping free despite her efforts to hold them back. Malik made no grand vows. He only left her with one last longing glance, and an embrace so firm it seemed to carve itself into her soul. At the docks, the ship's horn wailed through the mist. Malik stepped onto the deck, turned back one last time, and Lien stood motionless in the rain, fingers clenching tightly around the cloth he had given her. The ship departed, and the young woman, carrying the life they had created, turned away against the wind, taking with her a piece of the man she had loved. No one knew then that from that very moment, fate had begun writing a story that would stretch across continents. That autumn, the river winds cut sharply through the wooden shacks lining the canal. Lien returned to her parents' home after Malik left. Her growing belly made it impossible to work as she once had. But what she feared more than hardship was her father's gaze, a man of strict tradition, hardened by life, bound by honor. When he saw his daughter, pregnant, unmarried, he froze. He didn't need to ask. He already knew. For a long moment, anger, disappointment, and pain swelled inside him. But then, he did not cast her out as the neighbors had predicted. Instead, he simply stepped forward and held her close. Her mother sobbed, running her fingers through Lien's hair, as if afraid of losing her all over again. The child was born on a gray morning. Lien labored through the pain alone. No father's voice to reassure her, no hand to hold on to. When the first cry rang out, everyone fell silent. The baby had deep brown skin, tight curls, and full lips, features unlike anyone in the village. They whispered behind her back, unable to mask their disapproval. But for Lien, this child was everything. She named her daughter Ariane, the name Malik had once whispered as he touched her belly before they parted. On Ariane's birth certificate, both parents' names were listed. Lien followed Malik's instructions, even if she had no idea whether he would ever return. The years that followed were filled with hardship. The money Malik had left slowly dwindled. Lien took any job she could find, washing dishes, sewing, hauling water, anything that would earn a few coins to buy milk for her child. There were nights when she held Ariane close in their cramped, leaky room, her back aching from carrying heavy loads all day. But as long as her daughter slept peacefully, all exhaustion melted away. Ariane grew strong and clever, but as she got older, her appearance became impossible to ignore. The village children taunted her, calling her the fatherless half-blood, or the lost dark-skinned girl. The adults whispered behind Lien's back, stealing quick, judgmental glances whenever she passed. Each time, Ariane would grip her mother's hand tightly and ask, "Mama, do I have a father?" Lien would smile sadly, gently placing a hand over her daughter's tight curls and whisper, "You have a very special father, far away. And one day, he will find his way back to us." Time flowed like the river, carrying childhood away in silence. Ariane turned 18 the year the monsoon winds arrived, slipping through every crack in their wooden home. By then, she was working as a laborer at a cement factory on the outskirts of the city. The job was grueling, hauling sacks of cement, her hands swollen and raw, her shoulders bruised and bleeding, but she never complained. She thought to herself, "My mother raised me with those small hands. I have to do the same." She was still the girl they called the outsider. Every day at work, she endured the stares, the snide remarks. Once a man yelled across the factory, "Whose bastard is that? Look at her. Does she really think she belongs here?" Ariane didn't respond, but that night she came home and collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing like a child. "Mama, if I don't look like you, if I don't look like anyone else, then what am I?" Lien wiped her daughter's tears, holding her close. "You are the result of a love greater than words, greater than prejudice. You are a bridge between two worlds. Never let anyone make you doubt that." Those words were like light at the end of a tunnel. From that day on, Ariane still carried cement, still endured the taunts. But something in her gaze had changed. She started looking beyond the factory, beyond the dust and the cranes, toward the horizon, as if she were waiting for something. Something her heart had never stopped believing in, that her father would come back. And what she didn't know was that in that very year across the ocean, a dark-skinned man in a dark suit stood on the balcony of a palace in Africa, signing a letter with quiet determination. A letter with a single request: "Help me find the daughter I left behind in Asia. She may be living in hardship, but I believe she is still alive." Nearly 2 decades had passed since Malik left Southeast Asia. From an unknown soldier, he had risen to become the president of a vast African nation. Power, prestige, and his portrait hanging in government halls could not erase the memory of those windswept evenings beneath the old wooden bridge, where a young woman had bid him farewell with tear-filled eyes. In his dreams, he often saw Lien's face, her gentle gaze holding him in silence, her small hands brushing against his one last time. And always in those dreams, there was a child, running toward him, only to disappear into the crowd. On National Day, after delivering a long speech to thousands, Malik returned to his office, locked the door, and sat alone. staring at an old photograph. A faded black and white image, edges worn with time, of himself and Lien by the riverbank in their youth. His chest ached. For years, he had lost the most important thing in his life, a child, and so he began searching. Since his country had no formal diplomatic ties with the nation where Lien had once lived, Malik was forced to go through the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which had once overseen the expeditionary forces in Indochina. He sent letters, providing what little information he had, a woman's name, a riverside town, a time when he had been stationed there, and one desperate plea. I do not seek recognition. I only need to know if my child survived. The request was passed through diplomatic channels. Then it spread to the public. International headlines exploded with the story. An African president launches a search for his long-lost daughter in Asia. The world reacted. Some were moved, others were skeptical. Some ridiculed it, calling it a political stunt. But Malik didn't care. He only told his advisors one thing. If I don't do this now, I will spend the rest of my life with a void that can never be filled. A young mixed-race woman named Maya, who closely matched the description, was identified by a humanitarian organization and brought to Africa. Malik welcomed her with great honor, but when he looked into Maya's eyes, he knew this was not the gaze he had seen in his dreams. Yet he did not turn her away. He embraced Maya, cared for her as his daughter, but deep inside, his heart remained unsettled. After Maya, the girl now recognized as President Malik's lost daughter, departed for Africa, the media in her home country erupted. Every major newspaper ran headlines about how President Malik had once been an expeditionary soldier, how he had joyfully reunited with his long-lost child after nearly 2 decades. The articles glorified him as a devoted father who never forgot his own bloodline. But in a small tin-roofed house on the outskirts of the city, Ariane remained silent. She worked, she read the news, and she buried her questions deep within herself. Meanwhile, Lien sat motionless, staring at the photograph of the man in the newspaper. Time had grayed his hair, carved deep lines into his face. But those eyes, she could never forget them. The eyes of the man who had once held her hand beneath the wooden bridge all those years ago. Then one evening, as rain poured relentlessly outside, a man appeared at their doorstep. He carried a worn-out folder, his face marked by hardship, his eyes sharp with determination. It was Lien's younger brother, Ariane's uncle. He had witnessed his sister give birth in tears. He had watched her endure 2 decades of silent suffering. Now he stepped inside and placed a stack of old photographs on the table. A picture of Lien and Malik at a festival, Ariane's birth certificate, where her father's name was listed as M. Malik in letters, ones Lien had written but never sent. Then in a steady voice, he said, "You are the real daughter of the president." Ariane froze. She let out a short, uneasy laugh, half disbelief, half fear. She had dreamed of her father. She had imagined reunion. And she had long buried those dreams beneath the dust of fate. But now, a sliver of light was breaking through the walls she had built around her heart. Her uncle did not waste time. The next morning, he went straight to a major newspaper, carrying all the evidence. The editorial team, already skeptical of how quickly Maya had been accepted as Malik's daughter, immediately assigned an investigative journalist to the case. In the days that followed, the city erupted. News headlines questioned everything. Was there a mistake? Could Ariane be the real daughter of President Malik? A bold front-page headline read, "One father, 2 daughters. Who is the true heir?" International news agencies took notice. A French journalist quickly tracked down Ariane's family, interviewed Lien, gathered photographs, and sent everything to Paris, where it was forwarded to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Within a week, the entire story, Malik and Lien's wartime love, the birth of Ariane, the years of hardship mother and daughter endured, was compiled into a detailed dossier. It was placed directly on President Malik's desk, and he was stunned. Before him was a photograph, a young woman, her eyes, so much like his own, her dark curls, her deep brown skin. But within those eyes, there was resilience, there was strength, and there was a wound that had never healed. Malik shot up from his chair. He called for his aides, and in a voice filled with urgency, he ordered, "Arrange a special flight. Bring her here, no matter what it takes." The plane touched down at an African airport at dawn. The sky burned red, a sign perhaps of fate. Ariane sat quietly in her seat, her fingers gripping her mother's hand tightly. For the first time, she was leaving her home country. For the first time, she was stepping beyond the narrow streets she had known all her life. And for the first time, her name had been spoken with honor. Not by just anyone, but by the president himself. They were brought to a vast white palace in the capital. Rows of soldiers lined the grand entrance, standing at attention, but Ariane barely noticed them. Her eyes were fixed on the man standing at the highest step of the grand staircase. His hair was streaked with silver. His towering figure exuded authority. His face bore the weight of time and power. But on his wrist, he wore a simple cloth bracelet, a piece of fabric that Lien had once tied around his wrist the day they said goodbye. Malik stepped down, slowly, each step heavier with emotion, with regret that had stretched across nearly 20 years. When he was only a few feet away, he stopped. He looked into her eyes. Ariane looked back. Neither of them spoke. Her hands trembled in her mother's grasp. Then he opened his arms, slowly, hesitantly. A simple gesture, yet within it were 1,000 apologies and 1,000,000 unspoken words. Ariane ran to him. Tears burst forth like a broken dam. Ariane clung to him, the man she had only known through stories, through an old photograph, and through a belief she had never let go of. Behind her, Lien stood still. When Malik finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, she simply nodded, her eyes red with emotion. No resentment, no reproach, only forgiveness. The kind that only a mother, a woman who had endured, could offer to the man who had left her behind with a child in the midst of war. That very day, President Malik stood before the international press and declared, "I am Ariane's father. I have spent 20 years searching for my daughter. From today, she is my pride and the pride of this nation." Following the reunion that shook the media, Ariane quickly became the center of attention in the African nation. Global news outlets ran headlines about the forgotten daughter found after nearly 2 decades. Her arrival was celebrated with the grandeur of a princess returning to her homeland. But in a quiet chamber in the western wing of the presidential palace, Maya, the young woman once mistaken for his daughter, sat in silence. Since the truth had come to light, no one had treated her unkindly. But the cautious glances, the unspoken distance, it was as if the world had suddenly pulled away the ground beneath her feet. Maya was not jealous, but inside her was a strange emptiness, as if she had lost something she had only just begun to believe in. One morning, as sunlight filtered through sheer white curtains, President Malik entered Maya's room. He sat across from her, not in his formal robes, not surrounded by security. Just a man who had walked through life carrying loss and regret. Maya sprang to her feet, bowing, ready to apologize. But Malik raised a hand, signaling her to stop. Then he spoke. "You do not need to apologize. No one chooses where they are born. But you have lived with kindness, with grace, and you are part of a story much greater than all of us." Maya's eyes welled with tears. "But I am not your daughter." Malik's voice was gentle. "Number, but you once believed you were. And in that belief, you carried a love without conditions for the father you thought you had. That is something I cannot ignore." A few days later, in the presence of international delegations and national media, Malik held a grand ceremony, not to deny Maya, but to officially adopt her as his daughter, with all the rights and honor that came with it. In his speech, he declared, "A father is not only the one who shares your blood, but the one who knows when to open his arms, so that no child ever feels abandoned." From that day on, Ariane and Maya lived together in the palace. They did not see each other as a replacement or the one who didn't belong. Instead, they became sisters, bound by an incomplete past, now sharing a future still unfolding. Together, they studied languages, culture, royal protocol, And sometimes they sat with Lien in the palace garden, listening to her tell stories of the old wooden bridge, where it all began. To the media, President Malik was no longer just a firm leader, but a symbol of compassion. To the people, this story was proof that love is not measured by DNA, but by the heart. Ariane's transition into her new life was not as effortless as many assumed. She had been accustomed to hard labor, to simple meals, to the weight of judgmental stares. Now she had to learn how to stand tall before a sea of cameras, to speak before hundreds, to answer questions she had never even considered. How does it feel to go from the daughter of a street vendor to the daughter of a president? She simply smiled and replied, "I never saw myself as lesser, because I know my mother never bowed to hardship." Lien was given her own villa within the presidential estate, but she remained unchanged. She still woke early, drank her ginger tea, and read the morning paper. In her free time, she planted vegetables, cooked traditional dishes, and taught the palace chefs how to make fish sauce, though she was the only one who could stomach it. Every evening after her studies, Ariane visited her mother. They sat together reminiscing. No bitterness, no regrets. Because in the end, they had not been separated forever. One day, Ariane was invited to speak at an international cultural summit on bridging divides between nations. On a grand stage under the glow of 100 spotlights, she stepped forward. Her dark curls framed her face, her modernized dye flowing elegantly. Applause filled the hall. She began with her own story. A child once labeled different. A girl who had once believed she was a mistake of war. But then she said, "I carry two bloodlines, two cultures, two histories. But I am not division, I am a bridge." Her speech was shared millions of times, and Ariane became a symbol of unity, of hope, of the impossible made real. And in a handwritten letter, Malik wrote to his daughter, "I was once a soldier, a husband who broke his promise, a father searching for the past. But because of you, I have learned, the future does not lie in power, but in how we treat the ones we love." Time moved forward as it always did. Wounds slowly healed. Empty spaces were gradually filled. Within the vast halls of the presidential palace, beneath the relentless sun of the capital, there were no more whispers of doubt, no more hesitant glances between two girls. Instead, there was laughter echoing from the rooftop, where Ariane and Maya sat together, eating green mango dipped in chili salt, freshly pounded by Lien's hands. Ariane was no longer the laborer girl, no longer the half-blood outcast, no longer a child of war. She had become a living bridge between East and West, between blood and love, between past and present. Maya, though not his biological daughter, was cherished as if she were. She pursued a degree in media studies, working alongside Ariane in cultural exchange programs and organizing charity events across Asia, the land that held a chapter of their family's history. As for Lien, after years of silent endurance, she could now smile without hiding her tears. People honored her as the mother of two continents, not just because she raised her children with food and sacrifice, but because she raised them with unwavering strength. President Malik, though still the leader of his nation, had become the gentlest man in the hearts of his two daughters. Whenever they argued, he never took sides. He would only say, "You are both gifts to me. One reminds me of the past I lost. The other teaches me about the future I can still mend." On the 20th anniversary of his presidency, Malik did not host a grand state banquet. Instead, he invited journalists to the palace garden, a place where Ariane had planted rare flowers from Asia, where Maya had built a small bilingual theater stage, where Lien had placed an old wooden table from her homeland, using it to teach the palace children how to write with ink brushes. Standing before the assembled press, Malik gave only a short speech. Some mistakes last a lifetime, but there are also miracles, born from a mother's perseverance, a child's quiet endurance, and a father's late awakening. Then he turned to Ariane, took her hand, and looked into her eyes for a long time. "Thank you for not disappearing." Tears streamed down Ariane's cheeks as she smiled. "I was there all along. You just hadn't seen me yet." And that is the lesson this story leaves behind. That love, even when forgotten, can still be found. That family is not just made of blood, but of the choices we make for one another. That forgiveness, though it may come late, can still heal. And that sometimes, love doesn't need a reason to begin, but it always takes courage to return.